Hi, I'm Anynewprovince, and is this possibly Pauper Playable? That's the question I want to answer about aokis bloodbriar brew that went 5-0 in a Pauper League at the end of the month of January. We're taking a very short break from Rivals of Ixalan this week because I just couldn't resist getting in a few games with this awesome spicy brew. It does a little bit of everything. It's an aggressive deck with its goblins, it's a mid-range deck with its interaction, and it can also go super huge in the late game with bloodbriar. Before I get into the deck tech, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know that you're enjoying everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Every card in this deck synergizes very well with Bloodbriar. Bloodbriar is a 2/3 for 3 from Eldritch Moon that says, whenever you sacrifice another permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Bloodbriar. There are no natural actions across the course of a game of Magic that cause you to sacrifice a permanent, so cards have to specifically state that something's being sacrificed. That's why a ton of cards in this deck are built around that synergy specifically. I'm going to start with the permanents that really just want to go to your graveyard in whatever way is possible. First, we have Ichor Wellspring, which is a 2-mana artifact that says when Ichor Wellspring enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Next, we have Terrarion, which is a 1-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped and says, 2, tap, sacrifice Terrarion, add 2 mana in any combination of colors to your mana pool. When Terrarion is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Our last artifact that really wants to go to the bin is Chromatic Star. Chromatic Star says 1, tap, sacrifice Chromatic Star, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. When Chromatic Star is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. What all these artifacts have in common is that they want to be sacrificed. They'll draw you cards if you can do that. There's cards in this deck that will sacrifice those artifacts, draw you those cards, pump your Bloodbriar, and usually give you another beneficial effect. Our last non-land artifact card is Sylvok Lifestaff. It says, equipped creature gets +1/+0, and whenever equipped creature dies, you may gain 3 life. It has an equip cost of 1. Sylvok Lifestaff might not draw you cards when it goes to the graveyard, but the life gain is incredibly important. There's lots of ways to put permanents in our graveyard after we have a Sylvok Lifestaff on them, and that'll get us out of lethal range of burn spells. It might help us against hyper-aggressive decks. It just seems like a really good inclusion here. Next, I'm going to talk about the really cool aggressive goblin package that this deck has. When I first saw Bloodbriar was making waves in leagues, I did not assume it would be alongside powerful 1-drops, but here we are. First, we have Kuldotha Rebirth. I mentioned that we have lots of ways to sacrifice stuff in this deck, and this is a pretty powerful way to do so. Kuldotha Rebirth costs 1 red mana and says, as an additional cost to cast Kuldotha Rebirth, sacrifice an artifact, which usually means we get to draw a card. Its effect is, create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Next, we have Mogg Raider, a continuous sacrifice outlet. Mogg Raider says, sacrifice a goblin, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I can see us sacrificing goblins to this, putting counters on our Bloodbriar, and making it absolutely enormous. Next, we have Goblin Bushwhacker, just 1 copy. It is a 1-mana 1/1 that has Kicker 1, which means you may pay an additional red as you cast the spell, and it says, when Goblin Bushwhacker enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. I don't think we're trying to do this as early as last week's Goblin deck, but I'm sure when Goblin Bushwhacker hits the battlefield, you're swinging for a lot. Next, we have Goblin Chirurgeon, yet another repeatable sacrifice outlet. This card says, sacrifice a goblin, regenerate target creature. If our opponents are pointing removal spells at our Bloodbriars, we can just sack off a goblin we don't need, put a counter on the Bloodbriar, and save it from that removal sometimes. Mogg War Marshal is a 2-mana 1/1 with Echo 1 and a red, which means at the beginning of your upkeep, if this came under your control since the beginning of your last upkeep, sacrifice it unless you pay its Echo cost. So it can sacrifice itself to its own effect, which is pretty useful with a Bloodbriar on board. Its effect is, when Mogg War Marshal enters the battlefield or dies, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, more goblins to sacrifice to our sacrifice outlets. Next is a spicy little bit of interaction. This is Spike Shot Goblin, which costs 2 and a red and says, red, tap, Spike Shot Goblin deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. We can equip this up with a Sylvok Lifestaff or pump it up with the sacrifice triggers from Mogg Raider in order to kill bigger things as the game goes on. I think this is going to be pretty sweet, and hopefully some recurrable interaction will help this deck get through to the late game. Our final goblin is what allows us to play one-ofs of other spicy goblins we might not always need. This is Goblin Matron, which costs 2 and a red and says, when Goblin Matron enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a goblin card, reveal that card and put it into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library. Next, I'm going to talk about the spells that this deck uses to survive in the early game. First, we have Lightning Bolt, which is just 1 red and it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. We have Sparksmith, which is 1 and a red for a goblin. It's a 1/1 and it says, tap, Sparksmith deals X damage to target creature and X damage to you, where X is the number of goblins on the battlefield. We're going to have lots of goblins, so that's a pretty big X. Crack Clan Shaman is our next piece of interaction. It's also a goblin, but I think it fits best here. Crack Clan Shaman says, sacrifice an artifact. Crack Clan Shaman deals 1 damage to each creature without flying. If we have enough artifacts on board, we can sometimes turn this into a pretty effective wrath effect. Crack Clan Shaman can only deal with creatures that don't have flying, and if we want to kill flyers, we'll cast this spell first. It's called Whiteout, and it says, all creatures lose flying until end of turn. Sacrifice a snowland, return Whiteout from your graveyard to your hand. So we can continuously pay the cost of Whiteout to sack snowlands to pump up our bloodbriar and sometimes just win the game out of the blue. Alright, let's look at this mana base. First we have Evolving Wild, which sacrifices to go into your library, find a basic land, and put it onto the battlefield tapped. This is really great alongside Bloodbriar because it fixes our mana and also pumps them up. We have 4 Great Furnaces, which are artifact lands that produce red. We want artifact lands because we have cards that like to eat artifacts. We have 1 Quicksand for shrinking down Tireless Tribes. It says sacrifice Quicksand, target attacking creature without flying gets -1, -2 until end of turn. I guess I can kill stuff besides Tireless Tribe too. We have 2 Jund Panorama, which are other sacrifice lands that fix our mana. They say, sacrifice Jund Panorama, search your library for a basic swamp, mountain, or forest card, and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Finally, our last non-basic land is Tree of Tales. It's another artifact land, only this one taps for green. In terms of basic lands, we have 1 snow-covered forest and 7 snow-covered mountains. These are snow-covered because we have to sacrifice them to Whiteout eventually. We only need the 1 forest because we have a lot of other spells in our library that can fix our mana, like Chromatic Stars or Terrarians. Alright, let's talk about this sideboard. First we have Gorilla Shaman, which says pay X, X, and 1, destroy target non-creature artifact with converted mana cost X. This is just a repeatable Stone Rain effect for affinity decks. We have 2 more Crack Clan Shamans because its effect is very powerful and we might want a couple more of these guys in there. We have 3 Pyroblasts for countering blue spells or destroying blue permanents out of decks that have those. We have 1 Ancient Grudge. This is probably for when we want to kill creature artifacts or artifacts that are too big for our shaman to deal with. We have 2 Feed the Clans for staying out of burn range. We have 2 Serene Hearts for blowing up all of those Boggles auras or blowing up some of the auras out of the heroic deck. We have another Whiteout if we're up against all flyers. We can bring this in with the Crack Clan Shamans and wrath just about anything. And we have 2 Relic of Progenituses for hating out those Moments pieces in Tron graveyards. I'm honestly still trying to figure out exactly what this deck should be called, but I like fun names, so I'm going to call it Gobobriar. We're going to be taking Gobobriar live into a league on Tuesday night at twitch.tv/Anynewprovince. We're there every Tuesday night playing Possibly Pauper Playable decks. I just want to remind you before I go that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. So there it is, Gobobriar. I really hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.